There comes a moment in life when nothing explodes, no final argument, no dramatic goodbye, no last message sent at midnight. Everything looks quiet on the outside, but inside, something breaks open. You realize the pain isn't coming from what happened anymore. It's coming from how long you've been carrying it. From the conversations that never happened. From the apologies that never came. From the silent hope that one day, someone will finally understand. And then a frightening thought appears. What if holding on is what's slowly stealing your life, not the loss itself? This is not a story about confrontation. It's not about closure given by someone else. It's about the most difficult act of self-love, letting go quietly, without revenge, without explanations, without needing to be right. And what happens when you finally do may change the way you see healing forever. If this message resonates with you, please subscribe to the channel Buddhism in Every Moment. Your support helps us continue creating deeper, more meaningful videos to guide you back to peace, clarity, and yourself one quiet moment at a time. Part 1: The Quiet Truth About Self-Love. There is a version of self-love that is loud. It announces itself. It demands recognition. It fights to be seen, to be validated, to be proven right. And then there is the kind of self-love almost no one talks about. The kind that doesn't post quotes. The kind that doesn't explain itself. The kind that doesn't need witnesses. This is the self-love that begins in silence. Most people grow up believing that loving yourself means standing your ground, speaking your truth at all costs, or never letting anyone get away with hurting you. In a culture that celebrates strength through resistance, self-love is often framed as a battle one, where you must win, defend, and prove that what you felt was justified. But Buddhism offers a very different, much quieter truth. Self-love is not the act of holding on. It is the courage to let go quietly. Not because the pain wasn't real. Not because what happened didn't matter. But because your life does. There comes a moment, often unnoticed by the outside world, when something inside you grows tired. Not the kind of tired that sleep can fix, but a deeper exhaustion, the kind that comes from carrying emotional weight for too long. You wake up one morning and realize that the argument has ended. The relationship has ended. The chapter has ended, but your mind never received the memo. You're still explaining, still replaying, still waiting. And that's when a painful realization begins to surface. The suffering is no longer coming from them. It's coming from your attachment to what should have been different. This is where true self-love begins, not with empowerment slogans, but with honesty. Buddhism teaches that suffering does not only arise from painful experiences, but from clinging to them. Pain happens once in time. But when the mind refuses to release it, pain becomes a place we live in. We revisit it at night. We carry it into new relationships. We bring it into moments that were meant to feel peaceful. And we call this loyalty. We call it strength. We call it self-respect. But quietly, it drains us. Self-love, in its deepest form, is the moment you stop reopening the wound just to prove that it hurt. It's the moment you realize that explaining yourself again will not bring relief. That sending one last message will not suddenly make the other person capable of understanding. That waiting for acknowledgement is slowly turning into self-abandonment. This kind of self-love does not slam doors. It closes them gently, without anger, without revenge, without needing the other side to notice. There is something profoundly unsettling about silence in a world that expects reactions. When you stop responding the way you used to, people may misinterpret your quiet as weakness, avoidance, or indifference. But Buddhism reminds us that silence is often not the absence of strength. It is the presence of clarity. Silence is what happens when you finally see that your peace does not depend on being understood by someone who has already shown you who they are. This is not about suppressing emotions. It's about no longer throwing your heart into places where it continues to be injured. It's about recognizing that your truth does not need to be repeated endlessly to remain valid. Your pain was real the moment you felt it. It does not require an audience to exist. And yet, the mind resists this idea. The mind says, if I let go quietly, it means I lost. It says, if I stop explaining, they'll never know how much they hurt me. It says, if I don't fight for my story, it will be erased. But Buddhism gently asks a different question. What if holding on is what's erasing you? What if self-love is not about making noise, but about conserving your energy for the life that is still unfolding? In many modern cities, places full of movement, ambition, and endless stimulation, people carry invisible grief. On crowded sidewalks and quiet subway platforms, there are hearts still arguing with someone who is no longer there. Still waiting for a message that won't come. Still rehearsing words meant for a conversation that ended long ago. This inner noise becomes so familiar that silence feels uncomfortable at first. Letting go feels like standing in an empty room with no distractions. And the mind panics because it has learned to survive through attachment, even painful attachment. But Buddhism teaches that peace does not arrive through resolution. It arrives through release. Self-love is the decision to stop bleeding in places where no one is listening. It's choosing not to carry the past into every new moment. It's realizing that your nervous system deserves rest. That your heart deserves a break from reliving the same story. That you don't have to keep the door open just to prove that you cared. You can care deeply and still walk away. This is one of the hardest truths for the modern mind to accept. We are taught that caring means staying engaged, staying connected, staying emotionally available. But Buddhism introduces a more compassionate perspective. Sometimes, caring for yourself means withdrawing your energy from what no longer nourishes you. Not out of bitterness, out of wisdom. Self-love is not dramatic. It doesn't demand closure ceremonies or final speeches. It often looks like doing nothing at all on the outside. But internally, it is one of the most radical shifts a person can make. It is the shift from asking, "Why did this happen to me?" to quietly saying, "I don't want to carry this anymore." And that decision changes everything. When you stop chasing understanding from the wrong places, something subtle happens. The mind begins to soften. The constant inner dialogue slows. The emotional charge around certain memories starts to loosen, not because they were erased, but because you stopped feeding them with attention. This is not numbness. This is relief. Buddhism teaches that whatever you give your attention to grows. Pain grows when it is rehearsed. Anger grows when it is justified over and over again. But when attention is gently withdrawn, these states lose their grip. They pass through awareness instead of taking residence. Self-love, then, is not about adding more affirmations or becoming someone new. It is about subtracting what is harming you. It is about recognizing that you were never meant to live inside your wounds. Many people fear that letting go quietly means becoming passive, weak, or invisible. But Buddhism points to a deeper truth. There is nothing weak about choosing peace in a world addicted to conflict. There is nothing passive about refusing to let your inner life be dictated by someone else's limitations. In fact, this quiet self-love requires immense courage. It takes courage to stop explaining when you know you could. It takes courage to stop waiting when hope feels familiar. It takes courage to sit with the discomfort of silence long enough for it to transform into clarity. And clarity always arrives quietly. This is the kind of self-love that does not seek validation, because it has learned something essential: peace cannot be negotiated. It can only be chosen. When you let go quietly, you are not denying your story. You are simply refusing to let it become your identity. You are allowing life to move forward without dragging the past behind you. And in that movement, something extraordinary happens. You begin to feel yourself again, not as someone defined by what hurt you, but as someone still capable of presence, connection, and calm. You begin to experience moments without the constant background noise of resentment or longing. The heart, no longer on guard, slowly returns to balance. This is not the end of pain, but it is the end of unnecessary suffering. Buddhism teaches that self-love is not loud because truth does not need to shout. It does not argue because it does not doubt itself. It does not chase because it knows where home is. And home, in this teaching, is not a person, a resolution, or an explanation. Home is the quiet place inside you that no longer needs to hold on to be whole. That is where self-love truly begins. Part 2: How the mind turns one moment into a lifetime of pain. There is a quiet misunderstanding about pain that almost everyone carries, yet very few ever question. We believe pain is something that happens to us: an event, a moment, a wound inflicted by circumstances, or by another person. And in one sense, that is true. Pain does arrive through experience. Something is said, something is done, something is lost, a boundary is crossed, a trust is broken. But Buddhism invites us to look deeper, beyond the surface of the event itself, into the invisible mechanism that decides whether pain will pass or stay. The truth is unsettling at first. Pain may arrive from the outside, but suffering is created inside the mind. A painful moment happens once in time. It belongs to a specific day, a specific hour, a specific version of you that no longer exists in the same way. Yet for many people, that moment never truly ends. It stretches itself across years, silently repeating, quietly shaping emotions, reactions, and even identity. Not because the pain was too big to survive, but because the mind keeps returning to it. This is the subtle power of attachment. Attachment does not always look like longing or desire. Sometimes it looks like resentment. Sometimes it looks like self-protection. Sometimes it disguises itself as analysis, reflection, or the need to understand. But beneath all its forms, attachment is simply the refusal to let an experience be complete. The mind believes that if it replays the memory enough times, something will finally change. That if it revisits the moment from every angle, relief will eventually appear. That if it holds on tightly enough, the pain will lose its power. But what actually happens is the opposite. Each replay gives the pain a second life. Buddhism teaches that the mind does not distinguish clearly between what is happening now and what is being vividly remembered. When you replay a painful memory, the body responds as if the threat is present again. The breath becomes shallow. The chest tightens. The nervous system prepares for danger that no longer exists in this moment. This is why a single sentence spoken years ago can still cause your heart to race. Why a memory can interrupt a peaceful afternoon without warning. Why silence at night feels louder than noise during the day. The event is over, but the experience is being relived. And slowly, without realizing it, the mind turns a moment into a place. A place you keep visiting, even when it costs you your present. This is not because you are weak. It is because the mind is trying to protect you in the only way it knows how. The mind believes that remembering prevents future harm. It tells you, don't forget how that felt. Don't let your guard down. Don't trust too easily again. And while this intention may seem reasonable, it comes with a hidden cost. Protection becomes imprisonment when it never ends. What was meant to be a lesson becomes a sentence. Many people live their lives with one foot in the present and one foot in a memory that never healed. They function, they smile, they move forward on the surface, but inside, a part of them is still standing in that moment, waiting for it to resolve. And because resolution never comes from the past, the waiting becomes endless. Buddhism calls this suffering the act of suffering again and again through attachment. Not because the pain is still happening, but because the mind refuses to release it. This is one of the most difficult truths to accept. The mind can become attached to pain itself. Pain becomes familiar. Pain becomes known territory. Pain becomes something the mind understands how to navigate. Letting go, on the other hand, feels like stepping into the unknown. And the mind resists the unknown, even when it is peaceful. So it holds on. It holds on through imagined conversations that never happen. It holds on through questions with no healing answers. It holds on through the constant mental review of what could have been said differently. And with every repetition, the wound stays open. This is how a single moment quietly grows into a lifetime of inner tension. Buddhism does not teach that you should force yourself to forget. Forgetting is not a choice, and it is not necessary for healing. What matters is not whether a memory arises, but whether you follow it when it does. A memory can appear like a passing cloud, or it can become a storm depending on what you do next. When the mind grabs onto the memory and begins to analyze, judge, or resist it, suffering is recreated. When the mind allows the memory to arise and pass without attachment, it loses its power. This distinction is subtle, yet life-changing. Many people believe they are holding on because they want justice, closure, or understanding. But Buddhism gently points out that often, the mind is simply afraid of silence. Afraid of what remains when the story is no longer being told. Because when the story ends, you are left with yourself. And for someone who has lived inside pain for a long time, that can feel unfamiliar. So the mind keeps talking. It replays the words they said. It revisits the moment of betrayal. It returns again and again to the same emotional crossroads, hoping for a different outcome. But time does not move backward, and the mind, when trapped in repetition, slowly drains the joy from the present moment. This is why people can sit in beautiful places and still feel heavy. Why they can achieve long-awaited goals and feel strangely empty. Why peace feels always just out of reach, even when nothing is wrong anymore. The mind is elsewhere. Buddhism teaches that the present moment is the only place where life actually unfolds. When the mind is anchored in the past, it cannot fully receive what is happening now. It misses subtle joys. It dulls curiosity. It filters new experiences through old wounds. And this is how suffering becomes self-perpetuating, not through new pain, but through old attachment. Letting go, then, is not about denying what happened. It is about recognizing that reliving the past does not heal it. That no amount of mental repetition will rewrite the event. That carrying the memory as a burden does not honor your pain, it extends it. This realization can feel confronting. It asks you to take responsibility not for what happened, but for what you are doing with it now. And that responsibility is not a punishment. It is an invitation to stop feeding the pain with your attention. Buddhism teaches that whatever you nourish grows. When attention is given to resentment, it strengthens. When attention is given to regret, it deepens. But when attention is gently withdrawn, these states begin to fade, not because they are suppressed, but because they are no longer sustained. Peace does not come from solving the past. It comes from releasing your grip on it. At first, this release feels unnatural. The mind reaches back automatically, like a hand searching for something familiar. But with awareness, you begin to notice this movement. You see the moment when the memory arises. You feel the urge to follow it. And for the first time, you pause. That pause is powerful. In that pause, you realize that you have a choice. Not to erase the memory, but to stop entering it. This is where suffering begins to loosen. The memory may still visit, but it no longer lives rent-free in your inner world. It no longer dictates your mood, your reactions, or your sense of self. And slowly, the space around it grows. This space is not emptiness. It is freedom. Freedom from the endless loop of re-suffering. Freedom from the belief that healing lies somewhere in the past. Freedom from the quiet exhaustion of carrying a moment that has already ended. Buddhism does not promise a life without pain. But it offers something far more valuable, a way to stop turning pain into a permanent home. When you see clearly how the mind creates suffering through attachment, something shifts. Not all at once. Not dramatically. But gently, steadily, like tension releasing from a clenched fist. You begin to understand that the past does not need to be solved to be released. It only needs to be allowed to be complete. And in that understanding, the present moment slowly opens again. Not because the past disappeared, but because you stopped living inside it. This is how one moment stops becoming a lifetime of pain. Not through force. Not through forgetting. But through awareness that finally lets the mind rest. Part 3: Silence as emotional maturity. There is a kind of silence that feels heavy, uncomfortable, even frightening at first. It is not the silence of avoidance, not the silence of fear, not the silence of someone who has nothing to say. It is the silence that comes after you finally understand something about yourself that you can no longer unsee. In my experience, this silence is one of the clearest signs of emotional maturity. We live in a world that equates strength with response. If something hurts us, we are taught to speak up. If we feel misunderstood, we are encouraged to explain. If someone crosses a line, we are told to defend ourselves immediately, clearly, and loudly. There is a deep cultural belief, especially strong in modern American life, that if you don't speak, you are losing. If you don't respond, you are weak. If you don't correct the narrative, your truth will disappear. For a long time, I believed this too. I believed that silence meant I was allowing injustice. That if I didn't explain my pain, it would somehow mean it wasn't real. That staying quiet was the same as letting someone get away with it. And I know many people listening carry this same belief, because it feels logical. It feels fair. It feels like self-respect. But Buddhism and life itself, if you pay close enough attention, reveals a deeper truth. Not all silence is surrender. Some silence is clarity. There is a moment that arrives quietly in a person's life, when they realize something painful but freeing. Explaining yourself to someone who has already decided not to understand you is not self-respect. It is self-drain. This realization doesn't come all at once. It comes through exhaustion. Exhaustion from repeating the same story. Exhaustion from choosing the right words and watching them land nowhere. Exhaustion from hoping that if you say it one more time, differently this time, something will finally shift. And then, one day, the impulse to speak fades, not because you suddenly have nothing to say, but because you finally see that saying it won't bring peace. This is where emotional maturity begins. Buddhism teaches that true strength is not found in reaction, but in awareness. When someone hurts you, the ego immediately wants to respond. It wants to correct, defend, justify, and prove. This reaction is automatic. It feels urgent. It feels necessary. But urgency does not always equal wisdom. Silence, in this context, is not about suppressing your truth. It is about recognizing when your truth is being offered to a space that cannot hold it. There is a profound difference between speaking from clarity and speaking from pain. Pain wants relief. Clarity wants peace. And in my own life, I have learned that when words are driven by pain, they rarely lead to healing. There were times when I explained myself perfectly calm, articulate, honest, and still felt emptier afterward. Not because my words were wrong, but because the person hearing them was not capable of meeting them. That realization was humbling. It forced me to confront something uncomfortable. My need to be understood was keeping me emotionally tied to someone who no longer deserved access to my inner world. Silence became the boundary I didn't know how to set with words. Buddhism often speaks about conserving energy, not as a concept, but as a lived practice. Every emotional reaction costs something. Every explanation requires effort. Every attempt to be understood pulls attention away from the present moment and back into the wound. When you choose silence, not impulsively, not bitterly, but consciously, you are choosing to stop paying that cost. And this choice is deeply misunderstood. Silence is often labeled as passive-aggressive, cold, or dismissive. But silence, when chosen with awareness, is none of these things. It is an act of discernment. It is the moment you realize that not every situation deserves your emotional labor. Here is a truth that took me years to accept: you can be right, honest, and sincere, and still be speaking to someone who cannot hear you. And that is not a failure on your part. Emotional maturity is knowing when continued communication is no longer connection, but self-abandonment. It is knowing when speaking keeps the wound open, and silence allows it to close. In Buddhism, silence is closely connected to mindfulness. When you stop reacting, you begin observing. You notice the urge to speak arise. You feel the tension in your body that wants release. You recognize the familiar pattern, the need to explain, to justify, to be seen. And instead of acting on it, you pause. That pause is where wisdom lives. In that pause, you may realize that what you actually want is not understanding, but relief. Not validation, but peace. And peace does not come from being heard by the wrong person. It comes from no longer needing them to hear you. This is one of the most liberating shifts a human being can make. I want to be very clear about something here. Silence does not mean you never speak. It means you become selective. It means you stop throwing your truth into spaces where it will be misunderstood, minimized, or used against you. It means you recognize that your inner world is sacred, and not everyone has earned the right to enter it. This kind of silence feels strange at first. The mind panics. It worries about being misjudged. It fears that silence will be interpreted as weakness or guilt. But over time, something remarkable happens. The need to control the narrative fades. The urgency to explain dissolves. And in its place, a quiet confidence emerges. You begin to trust that your experience is valid even if no one else acknowledges it. That trust is emotional maturity. In modern life, especially in a culture driven by constant communication, texts, notifications, social media, silence has become rare. We are always reachable, always responding, always clarifying. And this constant availability creates the illusion that we owe everyone an explanation. We don't. One of the most powerful lessons I have learned is this: you do not owe access to your emotions to someone who has shown you they cannot handle them with care. Silence, then, becomes an act of self-respect. Not the loud kind that demands recognition, but the quiet kind that protects your nervous system. It allows your body to settle. It gives your mind space to return to the present. It interrupts the cycle of emotional reactivity that keeps suffering alive. And there is something else. Silence gives you something unexpected. It gives you clarity. When you stop reacting, you start seeing. You see patterns you couldn't see before. You notice how often your words were an attempt to fix something that wasn't fixable. You realize how much energy you were spending on someone else's limitations. And this realization is painful, but it is also freeing. Because once you see it, you can no longer pretend that explaining will save you. Buddhism teaches that silence is not emptiness. It is fullness without noise. It is the space where understanding deepens without force. When you allow silence, emotions that were tangled begin to untangle. Thoughts that were loud soften. The inner world becomes less crowded. And in that quiet, you begin to hear something else, your own wisdom. This wisdom does not shout. It does not argue. It does not rush. It simply knows when enough is enough. Emotionally mature silence is not about cutting people off harshly. It is about gently withdrawing from what drains you. It is about knowing when engagement leads to growth and when it only leads to more pain. It is about choosing not to participate in conversations that keep you stuck in the past. One of the most grounding realizations Buddhism offers is this: you do not need agreement to move forward. You do not need apology to reclaim dignity. You do not need acknowledgement to validate your experience. Your pain was real. Your feelings mattered. And they still do, even in silence. Silence is the moment you stop asking someone else to confirm your worth. In my opinion, this is one of the bravest things a person can do. It requires sitting with discomfort. It requires letting go of the fantasy that the right words will fix everything. It requires trusting that peace is more important than being understood. And that trust is earned through experience. Over time, silence stops feeling like absence and starts feeling like relief. The inner arguments quiet down. The urge to explain weakens. You begin to feel lighter, not because the past disappeared, but because you stopped carrying it into every interaction. This is not emotional coldness. It is emotional intelligence. Silence becomes the space where healing can finally breathe. Buddhism teaches that mastery is not about controlling others, but about mastering the self. When you choose silence over reaction, you are practicing this mastery. You are saying, without words, that your healing matters more than winning an argument. And that choice changes the direction of your life. You begin to respond instead of react. You begin to listen inwardly instead of defending outwardly. You begin to feel grounded in yourself, not dependent on someone else's understanding. This is why silence, when chosen consciously, is not weakness. It is the quiet confidence of someone who no longer needs to prove their pain to be free from it. And in that quiet confidence, something profound takes root. Peace. Part 4: Forgiveness without reconciliation. Forgiveness is one of the most misunderstood words in the language of healing. I say this not as a theory, but as something I learned the hard way through resistance, anger, confusion, and years of holding on long after the moment had passed. In my opinion, much of the suffering people carry around forgiveness does not come from the pain itself, but from what they believe forgiveness is supposed to mean. We are often taught directly or indirectly that forgiveness is something noble you offer to someone else. That it is an act of generosity, a moral high ground, a gesture of maturity. And because of that belief, forgiveness can feel unfair. Why should you be the one to forgive when you were the one hurt? Why should you release anger when no apology was given, no responsibility taken, no repair attempted? This is where Buddhism gently but firmly changes the conversation. Forgiveness, in its truest form, is not for the comfort of the person who caused the pain. It is for the freedom of the one who carries it. And that freedom does not require reconciliation. This distinction is crucial. Reconciliation involves two people. Forgiveness, in Buddhist wisdom, is an inner act. It happens entirely within you. It does not depend on whether the other person understands, regrets, or even remembers what they did. It is not a transaction. It is a release. I want to say this clearly, because many people need to hear it. You can forgive someone and still never allow them back into your life. In fact, I believe this is one of the most mature forms of forgiveness there is. For a long time, I thought forgiving meant reopening doors. It meant softening boundaries. It meant risking myself again. And because I was not ready or willing to do that, I resisted forgiveness altogether. I held on to anger as a form of self-protection. Anger felt justified. It felt like proof that what happened mattered. But anger has a hidden cost. Buddhism teaches that anger binds us energetically to the very person we want to be free from. Even when they are no longer present, even when the relationship has ended, anger keeps the connection alive. It lives in the body. It tightens the chest. It sharpens the mind. It whispers old stories when you least expect them. The person who caused the harm may have moved on with their life. But resentment keeps you emotionally tied to them, sometimes for years. This is not punishment for them. It is imprisonment for you. One of the most powerful metaphors in Buddhist teaching compares anger to holding a burning coal with the intention of throwing it at someone else. You are the one who gets burned first. I used to think this was just a poetic image. But over time I felt its truth in my own body. The exhaustion, the tension, the way resentment seeped into moments that had nothing to do with the original pain. Anger is heavy, it consumes energy, and it quietly steals joy from places where it does not belong. Forgiveness, then, is the moment you decide to put the coal down. Not because what happened was acceptable, not because the pain didn't matter, but because you no longer want to keep burning. This is where forgiveness without reconciliation becomes an act of deep self-love. It says, I am choosing peace over punishment. It says, I will not let this wound define my inner life. It says, I refuse to carry this anger any longer. And this decision does not need to be announced. It does not require a conversation. It does not need to be explained or justified. In many cases, forgiveness is most powerful when it remains quiet. Buddhism teaches that forgiveness begins with understanding, not agreement, not excuse, but understanding. Understanding that people act from their own conditioning, fears, wounds, and limitations. This does not make their actions right. It makes them human. In my experience, this understanding is what loosens the grip of hatred. When you see clearly that someone's harmful behavior was a reflection of their inner state, not your worth, something shifts. The story changes. You stop asking, why did they do this to me? And begin to see, this is what they were capable of at that time. This shift does not erase the pain, but it removes the personalization that keeps it alive. One of the hardest lessons I've learned is that waiting for an apology places your peace in someone else's hands. Many people never apologize not because the harm was small, but because they lack awareness, humility, or emotional capacity. Some are unable to face themselves. Others protect their ego at all costs. If your healing depends on their acknowledgement, you may wait forever. Forgiveness without reconciliation is the moment you stop waiting. It is the inner decision that says, I don't need your awareness to move forward. And that decision is incredibly empowering. There is a quiet strength in forgiving without reopening the door. It means you have learned the difference between compassion and self-sacrifice. It means you can wish someone well without allowing them access to your inner world. It means you no longer confuse love with endurance. In Buddhism, Compassion without wisdom leads to suffering. But compassion guided by wisdom leads to freedom. Forgiveness guided by wisdom understands that reconciliation is not always safe, healthy, or necessary. Some relationships end, not because love was absent, but because harm became too great. Forgiveness does not rewrite that reality. It simply allows you to stop fighting it. I believe this kind of forgiveness is one of the most courageous acts a person can make. It requires you to feel the anger fully, and then choose not to let it run your life. It requires you to grieve what you hoped the relationship could be. It requires you to accept that some people will never meet you where you are. And acceptance is not weakness. It is clarity. As forgiveness deepens, something subtle happens. The emotional charge around the memory softens. The intensity fades. The wound becomes a scar not because it disappeared, but because it healed enough to stop bleeding. You may still remember what happened, but it no longer controls your reactions. It no longer hijacks your mood. It no longer defines your identity. This is real healing. Forgiveness without reconciliation allows you to reclaim your inner space. It gives your mind permission to rest. It frees your heart from carrying someone else's mistakes as a permanent burden. And in that freedom, something beautiful emerges: balance. You become less reactive, more grounded, less pulled into old stories. You begin to respond to life as it is now, not as it once was. You stop dragging the past into every new moment. In Buddhism, freedom is an inner state. When you forgive not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly, you reclaim that freedom. You are no longer bound by resentment. You are no longer defined by the wound. You are no longer waiting for someone else to change so you can feel at peace. In my opinion, this is one of the most loving things you can do for yourself. Forgiveness without reconciliation is not about forgetting. It is about remembering without reliving. It is about honoring your pain without letting it imprison you. It is about choosing to live from clarity instead of anger. And perhaps most importantly, it teaches you this profound truth: you do not need to carry pain to prove that it mattered. Your experience was real. Your hurt was valid. And your healing does not require permission. When you put the coal down, your hands are free again. And with free hands, you can finally begin to build a life that is not shaped by what hurt you, but by what heals you. That is the quiet power of forgiveness without reconciliation. Part 5: Detachment is not coldness. There is a moment in healing that feels deeply confusing, almost frightening, because it goes against everything we were taught about love, loyalty, and care. It is the moment you begin to detach, not in anger, not in bitterness, but in quiet clarity. And almost immediately, a fear arises: am I becoming cold? Am I losing my heart? Am I turning into someone who no longer cares? I want to say this clearly, and I want to emphasize it with everything I have learned through experience: detachment is not coldness. Detachment is compassion directed inward. For a long time, I believed that caring meant staying emotionally connected no matter the cost. That love meant enduring confusion. That loyalty meant continuing to hope, even when hope was hurting me. And because of that belief, detachment felt like betrayal of the other person, of the relationship, and even of myself. But Buddhism teaches something radically different. It teaches that attachment, not love, is often what causes the deepest suffering. And attachment can exist even after a relationship ends. It lingers in expectations, unanswered questions, and quiet hopes that refuse to die. Hope, in this context, is not innocent. It is heavy. It shows up as the thought, maybe one day they'll understand. It whispers, if I wait a little longer, something might change. It disguises itself as patience, but it keeps the wound open. This is where detachment begins, not as rejection, but as recognition. Recognition that expecting peace from the same source that caused your pain is unrealistic. Recognition that no amount of emotional endurance will transform someone who is unwilling or unable to see. Recognition that your heart was never meant to be a place where harm is rehearsed. In my opinion, this realization is one of the most painful and liberating turning points in a person's life. Painful because it asks you to release not only the person, but the future you imagined with them. Liberating because it frees you from the exhausting cycle of waiting. Buddhism teaches acceptance of reality as it is, not as we wish it to be. This teaching sounds simple, but living it is incredibly difficult. We resist reality because we believe that letting go of expectation means letting go of love. But that belief is flawed. Love does not require self-abandonment. Detachment does not mean you never cared. In fact, it often means you cared deeply. It means you gave enough of yourself to finally recognize that continuing to hold on is harming you. Detachment is not the absence of feeling, it is the presence of awareness. There is a crucial difference between detachment and indifference, and confusing the two keeps many people stuck. Indifference is avoidance. It is shutting down, numbing out, pretending something never mattered. Detachment is honest. It acknowledges the feeling fully, but it no longer allows that feeling to control your actions or define your future. Detachment says, I see the pain clearly, and I choose not to live inside it anymore. This choice often feels strange at first. When you stop emotionally negotiating with the past, there is a quiet emptiness that appears. The mind no longer has its familiar loops. The heart no longer waits for signs. And in that space, many people feel lost. But that space is not emptiness. It is room. Room for your nervous system to rest. Room for clarity to arise. Room for healing to breathe. In modern life, especially in a culture that glorifies persistence and emotional intensity, detachment is often misunderstood as giving up. But Buddhism frames it as wisdom. When conditions are harmful, stepping away is not failure, it is discernment. I strongly believe this staying attached to what hurts you is not strength. Knowing when to step back is. Detachment begins the moment you stop asking, why did they treat me this way? And start accepting this is who they were in that moment. This shift is subtle, but profound. It moves you out of endless analysis and into grounded acceptance. Analysis keeps you mentally tied to the pain. Acceptance loosens the knot. When you detach, you are not erasing the past. You are simply no longer trying to extract something from it that it cannot give. You stop bargaining with reality. You stop telling yourself, if I do this, maybe they'll change. Or if I wait long enough, they'll realize my value. This kind of emotional bargaining is exhausting, and most people don't even realize they're doing it. They call it love. They call it patience. But underneath, it is attachment to an outcome. Buddhism teaches that attachment to outcomes is a direct source of suffering. When you detach, you release the need for a specific ending. You allow life to unfold without forcing it to match your expectations. And this does not make you passive. It makes you grounded. One of the most surprising things about detachment is how much lighter you begin to feel. Not because the pain vanishes overnight, but because you are no longer carrying it everywhere. The mind becomes clearer. Reactions soften. You begin to respond to situations instead of reacting from old wounds. Detachment allows you to remain kind without sacrificing yourself. This is important. Detachment does not turn you into someone who no longer feels empathy. On the contrary, it often deepens compassion because you are no longer overwhelmed by emotional entanglement. You can see others more clearly when you are not lost inside your own expectations. In Buddhism, detachment is not withdrawal from life. It is engagement without clinging. You still feel, you still care, but you no longer bleed internally for someone who cannot see your wounds. I want to emphasize something from my own experience. Detachment is not a one-time decision. It is a practice. The mind will return to old habits. Hope may resurface. Questions may arise. And each time, you are given another opportunity to choose clarity over longing. Each time you choose to step back instead of reaching forward, you strengthen your self-respect. And self-respect, I believe, is one of the most underrated forms of self-love. When you detach, you begin to trust yourself again. You stop outsourcing your peace to someone else's behavior. You realize that you cannot heal in the same environment that hurt you, and that leaving that environment is not rejection, but self-preservation. This understanding changes how you move through the world. You become more selective with your energy. You notice where you are drained and where you are nourished. You begin to listen to the subtle signals of your body instead of overriding them in the name of endurance. Buddhism teaches that suffering increases when we resist reality. Detachment is the practice of releasing that resistance. It is the moment you stop fighting what already happened and start honoring what you need now. And what you need is not more explanation, not more waiting, not more emotional labor. What you need is space. Space to grieve what was lost without clinging to what cannot return. Space to feel sadness without building an identity around it. Space to rediscover who you are when you are no longer defined by a relationship, a betrayal, or a disappointment. Detachment creates this space. And in that space, something gentle begins to grow. You start to feel moments of calm that don't depend on anything external. You notice that your thoughts no longer revolve endlessly around the same person or event. You begin to experience your life as it is now, not as a continuation of what hurt you. This is not emotional coldness. This is emotional freedom. In my opinion, detachment is one of the most compassionate acts you can offer yourself. It says, I have suffered enough. It says, I am allowed to stop carrying this. It says, my peace matters. Buddhism does not ask you to stop loving. It asks you to stop clinging. And when clinging falls away, love becomes lighter, wiser, and less painful. Detachment is the doorway to peace, not because it removes feeling, but because it removes illusion. You stop expecting someone else to complete your healing. You stop demanding answers that cannot heal you. You stop reopening wounds in the hope that this time they will finally close. And instead, you turn inward. You choose to protect your inner peace not with walls, but with clarity. You allow yourself to step back without guilt. You understand that walking away from harm is not cruelty, it is self-respect. Detachment teaches you that love does not require suffering, and care does not require endurance. It reminds you that you can release without hatred, step back without bitterness, and move forward without forgetting. And perhaps most importantly, it teaches you this truth: letting go does not make you less human. It makes you whole again. That is why detachment is not coldness. It is compassion, finally directed where it belongs toward you. Part 6: Closure comes from insight, not apology. There is a quiet belief that keeps many people emotionally suspended for years without realizing it. It sounds reasonable. It sounds fair. It even sounds healthy on the surface. The belief is this: once I get an explanation, once I hear an apology, once they finally admit they were wrong, then I'll be able to move on. I used to believe this deeply. And in my opinion, this belief is one of the most painful illusions the human mind creates. Because while it promises peace, it quietly postpones it. Buddhism teaches that attachment does not always look like clinging to a person. Sometimes it looks like clinging to an outcome. And one of the most common outcomes the mind clings to is closure delivered by someone else. The mind imagines a final conversation, a moment of honesty, a sincere apology, a sentence that finally makes everything make sense. And so it waits. This waiting can last months, sometimes years, sometimes an entire lifetime. What makes this especially painful is that the person you are waiting for may never know you are waiting at all. They may have moved on. They may lack the awareness to reflect. They may not remember the moment the way you do. Or they may protect themselves by avoiding responsibility altogether. And while they live their life, you remain emotionally paused, holding space for a moment that may never come. Buddhism gently but firmly reminds us of something difficult to accept. Placing your healing in another person's hands is itself a form of suffering. Closure that depends on someone else is fragile. It is uncertain. It is outside your control. And when your peace depends on something you cannot control, peace becomes conditional. In my experience, this is where many people get stuck, not because the pain was too great, but because they are waiting for permission to let go. The mind says, I can't move on yet. I don't understand what happened. But beneath that is another, deeper need, the need to be seen. Most people don't want an apology because of the words themselves. They want validation. They want confirmation that their pain was real, that it mattered, that it wasn't imagined or exaggerated. They want to know they weren't invisible. This desire is deeply human, and Buddhism does not dismiss it. But it does warn us what happens when our need to be seen becomes a requirement for healing. Your pain does not become real only when someone else acknowledges it. It was real the moment you felt it. Waiting for someone else to confirm that truth gives them power over your inner world. And often, the people who hurt us are the least equipped to offer that confirmation. I have learned that some people never apologize not because the harm was small, but because facing it would require them to confront parts of themselves they are not ready to see. Some lack emotional depth. Some lack courage. Some protect their ego at all costs. Others simply move through life unaware of the impact they leave behind. If your closure depends on such a person, you may wait indefinitely. This is not pessimism. It is realism. Buddhism teaches that expectation is a subtle form of attachment, and attachment always leads to suffering. Expectation ties your present peace to a future event that may never arrive. It keeps the wound open under the illusion of hope. True closure, Buddhist wisdom tells us, comes not from words spoken by others, but from insight that arises within. Insight does not mean justifying what happened. It does not mean excusing harm. It does not mean minimizing your pain. Insight means seeing clearly without illusion. It means understanding that people act from their own conditioning, fears, wounds, and limitations. This understanding does not make their behavior acceptable, but it explains why waiting for them to change, reflect, or apologize often deepens your pain instead of healing it. In my opinion, one of the most liberating realizations a person can have is this: no explanation can change what already happened. The mind believes that if it understands the why, the pain will soften. But understanding the cause does not undo the impact. What heals is not explanation, it is acceptance. Acceptance is not resignation. It is clarity. Acceptance says, this happened. I don't like it. It hurt me. And I choose not to live inside it anymore. This shift is subtle, but profound. It moves you out of endless questioning and into grounded presence. The mind stops asking, why did they do this to me? And begins to say, this is what happened, and I don't need to carry it forward. Buddhism also teaches impermanence, the truth that all things arise and pass away. Pain is no exception. But pain lingers when we cling to it. When we demand that the past return and fix itself. When we refuse to accept that some chapters end without explanation. This is one of the hardest lessons of life. Not every ending comes with clarity. Not every story resolves neatly. Not every wound is acknowledged. And yet, life moves forward anyway. Closure that comes from insight understands this. It understands that peace is not found by rewriting the past, but by releasing your grip on it. It understands that healing was never meant to arrive through someone else's words, but through your own awareness. I want to emphasize something here from my own experience. Closure is not something someone gives you when they are ready. It is something you create when you decide your peace matters more than their explanation. This decision does not happen in one dramatic moment. It happens quietly, gradually. It happens when you stop rehearsing what you would say if given the chance. It happens when you notice the question arise and choose not to follow it. It happens when you stop reopening the wound with thoughts that have no healing answers. This is not avoidance. This is wisdom. When closure comes from insight, something changes inside you. The emotional charge around the memory begins to fade. The intensity softens. The story loses its sharp edges. The event becomes something that happened, not something you continue to live inside. You may still remember, but you no longer relive. And that difference is everything. Insight-based closure also frees you from the illusion that peace is conditional. You stop waiting for the perfect apology, the perfect explanation, the perfect moment. You understand that peace is an inner state, not a response from the outside world. This understanding is deeply empowering. It returns authority to where it belongs within you. You realize that your healing does not require agreement. Your dignity does not require acknowledgement. Your worth does not require explanation. In my opinion, this is one of the most mature forms of self-love. It is choosing clarity over confusion. It is choosing stillness over endless mental noise. It is choosing to live now instead of waiting for the past to resolve itself. Buddhism teaches that freedom is internal. When you stop waiting for an apology, you reclaim that freedom. You stop handing your emotional well-being to someone who may never be able to hold it with care. As this insight settles in, the heart softens. The mind grows quieter. The need for answers slowly fades, not because you forced it to, but because it is no longer needed. What remains is calm acceptance. Acceptance that some people cannot meet you where you are. Acceptance that some wounds close without explanation. Acceptance that life does not owe you clarity in every situation. And in that acceptance, peace takes root. This is the kind of closure Buddhism points toward. Not a dramatic ending. Not a final conversation, but a quiet understanding that allows you to move forward without bitterness. Closure that comes from insight does not announce itself. It simply shows up one day as relief, as space, as the ability to breathe without the weight of unanswered questions pressing on your chest. It is the moment you realize that healing was never meant to come from outside you. It was always meant to arise from awareness, understanding, and acceptance. And when you see this clearly, something within you relaxes. You are no longer waiting. You are no longer stuck. You are no longer suspended between what was and what might have been. You are here. And that is enough. Part 7. Stop carrying what was never yours. There is a weight many people carry that does not come from what happened to them, but from what they decided, often unconsciously, to take responsibility for afterward. It is a quiet weight, invisible to the outside world, yet heavy enough to shape the way they think, breathe, and move through life. This weight has many names: guilt, shame, self-blame, emotional responsibility. But at its core, it comes from one deeply ingrained habit of the human mind: taking ownership of pain that was never meant to belong to you. In my opinion, this is one of the most exhausting and overlooked sources of suffering. When something painful happens, the mind immediately searches for meaning. This search is natural. We want to understand. We want to prevent the pain from happening again. But somewhere along the way, reflection quietly turns into self-accusation. Questions meant to bring clarity begin to turn inward in harmful ways. What did I do wrong? Why wasn't I enough? How could I have prevented this? These questions sound responsible. They sound mature. They sound like self-awareness. But often, they are not rooted in truth. They are rooted in fear, the fear that if you don't blame yourself, the world will feel unsafe. Buddhism teaches that suffering increases when we grasp and identify with pain. And one of the most common ways we do this is by turning pain into a personal verdict about who we are. Instead of saying, "Something painful happened," we begin to say, "Something is wrong with me." This shift is subtle, but devastating. I have seen countless people carry guilt for things they did not cause, shame for things they did not choose, and responsibility for emotions that were never theirs to manage. They replay moments endlessly, convinced that if they can just find the right mistake, the pain will finally make sense. But what they are really doing is punishing themselves for someone else's behavior. And that punishment becomes a lifestyle. Buddhism gently reminds us of a truth that feels almost radical in its simplicity: where your responsibility ends, suffering can begin to dissolve. When someone acts with cruelty, dishonesty, neglect, or emotional immaturity, those actions arise from their own conditioning, wounds, fears, and choices. Carrying their behavior as your personal failure does not make you compassionate. It makes you exhausted. This is something I feel very strongly about. Taking responsibility for what is not yours is not humility. It is self-erasure. There is a difference between reflection and self-blame. Reflection asks, "What can I learn from this?" Self-blame says, "This defines me." Reflection opens the door to growth. Self-blame traps you inside the pain. Buddhism teaches non-identification with suffering, not because pain doesn't matter, but because pain is an experience, not an identity. Pain passes through awareness. It does not need to become the center of who you are. And yet, many people fuse their identity with what hurt them. They say things like, "This broke me," or "This ruined me," or "I'm not the same person anymore." While these expressions come from real pain, they also quietly reinforce the belief that suffering is now who they are. I want to emphasize this deeply. What happened to you may have changed you, but it did not define you. When you stop carrying pain as a personal label, something inside you begins to open. Space appears where there was once tightness. Breath deepens. The inner dialogue softens. And in that space, peace begins to grow, not dramatically, but naturally. Another burden many people carry without realizing it is emotional labor for the person who hurt them. They worry about whether that person understands, whether they regret it, whether they are healing, whether they will ever change. This constant mental engagement keeps you emotionally tied to someone long after the relationship or situation has ended. Buddhism teaches non-attachment not as indifference, but as a way of reclaiming your energy. Your attention is precious. Your emotional energy is finite. When you spend it monitoring someone else's awareness, you are leaking life force into the past. In my experience, one of the most freeing realizations is understanding that you are not responsible for another person's growth, insight, or healing. You can care without carrying. You can remember without reliving. You can wish someone well without tracking their journey. Letting go of what is not yours also means releasing the illusion that you can fix the past by thinking about it long enough. The mind often believes that if it replays events enough times, a better ending will emerge. Buddhism teaches that this is an illusion. The past cannot be corrected through mental repetition. Each replay strengthens attachment. Each replay deepens the groove of suffering. When you recognize this, you don't need to fight the thoughts. You simply stop feeding them. You let them rise and fall like weather, without turning them into a permanent climate inside you. This is not repression. This is discernment. Compassion plays a quiet but essential role here. Compassion for yourself means acknowledging that you have suffered enough, that you do not need to keep suffering to prove that the pain was real, that you are allowed to rest from carrying what has exhausted you. Buddhism teaches that compassion without wisdom leads to self-sacrifice. But compassion guided by wisdom leads to peace. Wisdom knows when to put the burden down. I believe many people stay stuck, not because they cannot heal, but because they believe they must keep carrying pain to honor it. But pain does not require loyalty. It requires understanding. When you stop carrying what was never yours, peace does not arrive all at once. It grows slowly, quietly, like a plant nurtured by patience. You may still remember what happened. You may still feel moments of sadness, but the pain no longer sits heavy on your chest. It passes through instead of staying. This is how healing looks in real life, not dramatic, not perfect, but deeply human. You begin to notice that your thoughts are less harsh. Your inner voice softens. Your body relaxes. The nervous system slowly settles. You are no longer bracing against something that already ended. In Buddhism, freedom is not found by denying pain, but by releasing the extra weight we add to it. When you stop carrying guilt that is not yours, shame that does not belong to you, and responsibility that was never meant to be yours, you return to balance. And in that balance, self-love becomes something quiet and steady. Not something you force, not something you prove, but something you live. Stopping the habit of carrying what was never yours is one of the most profound acts of self-respect. It is the moment you say, I am allowed to heal without punishment. It is the moment you choose clarity over self-blame, compassion over endurance, and truth over fear. And that choice changes the way you move through the world. You become lighter not because life became easier, but because you stopped making it heavier than it needed to be. That is the quiet freedom Buddhism points toward. Part 8. Returning home to yourself. There is a moment in healing when you realize something quietly devastating and quietly liberating at the same time. You did not lose yourself because of what happened to you. You drifted away from yourself while trying to survive it. In my opinion, this is one of the deepest truths Buddhism offers, and also one of the most tender. Beneath all the pain, confusion, attachment, and effort to hold things together, there has always been a part of you that remained untouched. Calm, aware, whole, but pain has a way of pulling the mind outward into memories, stories, regrets, imagined futures, until you no longer live where your life is actually happening. Buddhism calls this wandering of the mind the birthplace of suffering. When something painful enters our life, the mind immediately leaves the present moment in search of meaning. It travels backward, replaying what happened. It travels forward, imagining what might still change. It searches relentlessly for answers, explanations, and control. And while the mind is busy doing this, something subtle happens. We are no longer home. Returning home to yourself is not about forgetting the pain. It is about returning your awareness to where it belongs. The present moment. This idea sounds simple, almost too simple, but living it is one of the most difficult practices there is. Because pain feels loud, and the present moment feels quiet. Pain feels urgent, and presence feels subtle, and when the mind has been conditioned to equate urgency with importance, it resists stillness. But Buddhism teaches something radically gentle. Peace does not need to be created. It already exists beneath the noise. What needs to happen is not adding more effort, but removing what pulls you away from yourself. In my experience, returning home to yourself begins not with grand insight, but with the body. The body never leaves the present moment. While the mind travels endlessly, the body remains here breathing, sensing, holding tension, releasing it. And this is why Buddhism places such deep emphasis on mindfulness of the body. When you reconnect with physical sensation, you begin to anchor yourself again in what is real. The feeling of your breath moving in and out. The weight of your body resting where it is. The simple fact of being alive right now. These are not spiritual ideas. They are direct experiences. And they matter because the present moment is the only place where peace can be felt. Pain often convinces us that staying present is dangerous, that if we slow down, we will be overwhelmed. But in reality, what overwhelms us is not presence but resistance. It is the fight against what already exists. When you allow yourself to be present with discomfort, without labeling it as a threat, something remarkable happens. The discomfort begins to change. Buddhism teaches impermanence not as a concept, but as something to be experienced directly. When you stay present, you notice that emotions rise, shift, soften, and pass. Even pain has movement. Even grief has pauses. This realization is deeply healing. In my opinion, one of the greatest lies pain tells us is that it will last forever. Presence exposes that lie gently, without argument. You don't have to convince yourself that things will get better. You simply have to stay long enough to see that nothing stays exactly the same. Returning home to yourself also means reclaiming your worth. Pain has a quiet way of distorting self-perception. After being hurt, many people begin to question their judgment, their value, their ability to trust. They wonder if they were naive, too much, not enough. And slowly, the mind begins to weave a story in which worth is conditional, dependent on how others treated you. Buddhism dismantles this story completely. Your worth was never dependent on someone else's awareness. Your value was never defined by how you were treated. What happened reflects the causes and conditions of another person's inner world, not the truth of who you are. Returning home to yourself is remembering this not intellectually, but viscerally. It is the moment you stop measuring your worth through someone else's behavior. It is the moment you release the false belief that rejection, neglect, or betrayal diminished you. In my own journey, this remembering did not come through positive thinking. It came through stillness, through moments when I stopped trying to fix myself and simply sat with what was there. Over time, I noticed something unexpected beneath the pain. There was stability. Beneath the confusion, there was awareness. Beneath the heartbreak, there was a quiet sense of being okay. Not happy, not healed, but okay. And that was enough to keep going. Buddhism teaches that awareness itself is protective. When you are present, you do not need to guard yourself with walls. You see clearly, you feel deeply, and you remain grounded. Wisdom creates openness, not fear. Returning home to yourself also means learning how to be alone without feeling abandoned. This is a sensitive point for many people. When you let go of someone who hurt you, there is often a period of emptiness. The emotional noise quiets. The familiar drama fades, and what remains can feel unsettling. Silence, space, stillness. Many people rush to fill this space: new relationships, distractions, constant stimulation, because they fear what the quiet might reveal. But Buddhism teaches that this space is not something to escape. It is something to honor. This is the pause where the heart resets. In the quiet, you reconnect with your own presence. You learn to sit with yourself without needing validation, explanation, or emotional intensity. And this ability to be with yourself gently is one of the deepest forms of self-love there is. In my opinion, much of what we call loneliness is actually unfamiliarity with ourselves. We are so used to defining ourselves through relationships, roles, and reactions that when those fall away, we don't know who we are anymore. Returning home to yourself answers that question not with words, but with experience. You are the one who is aware. You are the one who feels. You are the one who remains when everything else changes. Buddhism teaches impermanence to free us, not to frighten us. Everything changes. Pain arises and passes. Joy arises and passes. Relationships shift. Identities evolve. When you understand this deeply, you stop clinging to moments that hurt and stop fearing moments that will eventually end. You begin to flow with life instead of resisting it. And this flow feels like peace. Returning home to yourself is also the practice of trusting life again. Pain often makes the world feel unsafe, unpredictable, or unkind. Buddhism does not promise a life without pain. It teaches trust in change. Trust that no state, no matter how intense, is permanent. This trust does not come from blind optimism. It comes from presence. Each time you choose to return your attention to the breath, instead of a painful thought, you come home. Each time you soften instead of tightening around a memory, you come home. Each time you allow an emotion to pass without clinging, you come home. This is not a one-time event. It is a practice. And like all practices, it unfolds gradually. Over time, the emotional charge around memories softens. Thoughts lose their sharp edges. The heart becomes less guarded not because you are naive, but because you are grounded. You no longer need to protect yourself with constant vigilance. Awareness itself becomes your protection. One of the most profound shifts that happens when you return home to yourself is this: you stop trying to be someone else to avoid pain. You stop chasing versions of yourself that you think would have been less hurt. You accept who you are not as broken, but as human. And in that acceptance, compassion naturally grows. Not forced compassion. Not spiritual bypassing, but a gentle understanding of human suffering. You may begin to see others, including those who hurt you, as people struggling with their own pain. This does not invite them back into your life. It simply frees your heart from bitterness. Buddhism teaches that compassion without attachment is liberation. You can wish someone well without carrying them. You can understand without reopening wounds. This balance is wisdom. Returning home to yourself does not mean you will never remember what happened. It means you no longer live there. Memories may arise, but they pass like clouds through a wide sky. Awareness remains unchanged. This is one of the most comforting teachings in Buddhism. Awareness is like the sky. Vast. Open. Unharmed by passing weather. When you identify with awareness instead of pain, stability emerges naturally. You wake up with more ease. Your reactions soften. Your inner world feels more spacious. Not because you forced healing, but because you stopped abandoning yourself. In my opinion, this is the real meaning of self-love in Buddhism. Not becoming someone new. Not fixing yourself. But remembering who you were before suffering convinced you otherwise. Returning home to yourself is not an ending. It is a beginning. A quiet, steady beginning rooted in presence, trust, and truth. And from that place, healing no longer feels like a task. It feels like coming back to where you always belonged. Part 9: Reclaiming Your Life Energy. There comes a moment in healing when you notice something subtle before you can fully explain it. You are not suddenly happy. Life has not magically become easy. The past has not disappeared. And yet something inside you feels different. Lighter. Quieter. Less tense. It feels as if a constant background noise you once lived with has finally begun to fade. This moment marks the beginning of reclaiming your life energy. In my opinion, this is one of the most underestimated stages of healing. People often think healing is about feeling better emotionally, but Buddhism points to something deeper and more tangible: energy. Where your attention goes, your energy flows. And where your energy flows, your life takes shape. For a long time, much of your life energy may have been trapped in the past, invested in memories, resentments, imagined conversations, unanswered questions. You may not have noticed it happening, but slowly, your vitality was being drained. You felt tired in ways sleep could not fix, unmotivated without knowing why, emotionally heavy even when nothing was wrong. This is not weakness. This is exhaustion. Buddhism teaches that every thought you think, every emotion you cling to, and every memory you revisit consumes energy. When the mind is attached to pain, it becomes busy without rest. Even in moments of stillness, it continues working, replaying scenes, analyzing motives, preparing defenses for conversations that may never happen. This constant interactivity is not neutral. It drains life force. I believe many people underestimate how much energy resentment consumes. Anger tightens the body. It clenches the jaw. It contracts the chest. It keeps the nervous system on high alert, as if danger is still present even when the threat is long gone. The body does not know the difference between a real threat and a remembered one. So when you hold on to unresolved pain, your body continues to react as if it is still happening. The breath becomes shallow. Muscles remain tense. The heart works harder than it needs to. Over time, this state of chronic tension becomes exhausting. Reclaiming your life energy begins when you stop feeding this loop. Buddhism does not ask you to force the mind to be quiet. It asks you to gently remove the fuel that keeps it running. When you stop giving painful memories your full attention, the mind naturally slows. Not immediately, not perfectly, but steadily. And as it slows, energy begins to return. This return does not feel dramatic. It feels like relief. It feels like waking up with a little more ease. Like having space between your thoughts. Like noticing small moments again, the warmth of sunlight, the rhythm of your breath, the simple pleasure of being present without an agenda. These moments are not insignificant. They are signs that your energy is coming home. One of the most powerful teachings in Buddhism is that attention is power. Whatever you give your attention to grows stronger in your inner world. When you give attention to pain, pain expands. When you give attention to resentment, resentment deepens. But when you withdraw attention from what drains you, energy naturally becomes available for something else. Creativity, clarity, presence, joy. I have noticed in my own life that when I stopped mentally engaging with old wounds, I did not become numb. I became alive again. The energy that was once consumed by rumination became available for living, for listening, for creating, for simply being. This is not coincidence. It is cause and effect. Another way life energy is lost is through resistance. When pain arises and you fight it, judging it, wishing it away, telling yourself it shouldn't be there, you create an inner battle. And battles are exhausting. Buddhism teaches acceptance not as surrender, but as wisdom. Allowing emotions to arise and pass without resistance frees enormous amounts of energy. Acceptance says, this is here right now. Resistance says, this should not be happening. One creates tension, the other creates space. When you stop arguing with reality, energy that was used to fight what already happened becomes available for healing. Reclaiming your life energy also means withdrawing it from places where it is wasted. When you constantly think about someone who hurt you, you are still giving them your attention. Even in their absence, they remain present in your inner world. Buddhism teaches that attention is not neutral. It is a form of connection. When you stop giving attention to pain, you are not denying it. You are choosing not to let it dominate your inner life. And this choice changes how you relate to others as well. When unresolved pain drains your energy, it often spills into new relationships. You may become guarded, reactive, or emotionally distant without realizing why. But as energy returns, something shifts. You listen more deeply. You respond more calmly. You set boundaries without guilt. You stop projecting old wounds onto new situations. This is one of the quiet gifts of healing. Buddhism teaches that inner harmony naturally expresses itself outwardly. When you are no longer carrying unresolved pain, your presence changes. Others may feel it without knowing why. There is a steadiness to you, a groundedness, a sense that you are no longer leaking energy into the past. Reclaiming your life energy also restores your relationship with time. When your energy is stuck in memories, time feels heavy. Days blur together. The present moment feels dull. But when energy returns, time opens up. Moments feel richer. Life feels more immediate. You begin to experience again what Buddhism calls direct contact with life. The taste of food, the sound of silence, the sensation of breathing. These simple experiences become meaningful not because life became extraordinary, but because your energy is no longer elsewhere. In my opinion, this is one of the most profound shifts that happens when you let go quietly. Healing stops feeling like something you chase. It becomes something you live from. You are no longer trying to fix yourself. You are no longer trying to outrun pain. You are simply present. And presence is restorative. Buddhism teaches that awareness is like the sky, vast, open, unchanged by passing weather. When you identify with awareness instead of pain, your energy remains steady. Memories may still arise, but they pass. Emotions may still come, but they move through you instead of consuming you. This stability is not emotional coldness. It is emotional freedom. Over time, you may notice subtle but profound changes. You wake up with less heaviness. Your mind feels clearer. Your reactions soften. You feel more connected to yourself. These changes do not happen because you tried harder to heal, but because you stopped carrying what drained you. Letting go quietly restores what was always yours. In Buddhism, the highest form of self-care is not adding more to your life, but releasing what burdens the heart. When you let go of who hurt you, you reclaim the energy needed to live fully. This energy fuels awareness, compassion, creativity, and peace. It supports you in becoming present, grounded, and whole again. I believe this is why letting go quietly is such a powerful act of self-love. It is not about forgetting the past. It is about choosing life now. It is about returning your energy to the present moment and allowing it to nourish you instead of your pain. When life energy flows freely again, healing is no longer something you chase. It becomes the natural state you live from. And from that state, ordinary life begins to feel meaningful again. Not because it is perfect, but because you are finally here to live it. Part 10: Choosing Peace Over Being Right. There is a moment in every healing journey when the question quietly changes. It no longer asks, "Who was wrong?" or "Why did this happen to me?" or even "How do I heal?" Instead, a simpler, more unsettling question appears: do I want peace or do I want to keep being right? In my opinion, this is the most difficult choice a human being ever has to make, not because the answer is unclear, but because the cost of choosing peace requires us to let go of something the ego holds very dear. Being right feels powerful. Being right feels validating. Being right feels like proof that your pain mattered. When someone hurts you, the mind naturally wants acknowledgement. It wants the story to be seen clearly, who caused the harm, who suffered, who deserves understanding. This desire is human. It is not wrong. But Buddhism gently reveals what happens when the need to be right becomes the place where your identity rests. You stop living in the present. You start living inside an argument that never ends. The mind begins to replay conversations, real ones, imagined ones, rewritten ones. It constructs better responses, sharper explanations, perfect sentences that would finally make everything clear. And even when no words are spoken out loud, the inner debate continues. This is the quiet war most people don't realize they are fighting. I believe this inner war is one of the greatest sources of hidden suffering in modern life. People go to work, raise families, build lives while internally defending a truth that no one is asking to hear anymore. The body moves forward, but the mind stays behind, still holding its position. Buddhism teaches that clinging to being right is a form of attachment. And attachment, no matter how justified it feels, always leads to suffering. Even if you are right. This is one of the hardest truths to accept. The ego tells us that being right should bring relief. That once the truth is acknowledged, peace will arrive. But in reality, the emotional cost of holding on to that truth can far outweigh the comfort it promises. You can be right and still be exhausted. You can be right and still feel empty. You can be right and still be trapped. I have learned that peace and being right rarely coexist for long. When you choose to hold on to being right, you remain mentally engaged with the past. You stay tied to the person, the event, the injustice. You keep the door open not for healing, but for continuation. Choosing peace means closing that door. Not because the truth no longer matters, but because your life does. Buddhism teaches that arguments do not end when words stop being spoken. They continue internally, fueled by memory and imagination. Each mental argument consumes energy. Each replay tightens the nervous system. Each attempt to win inside your own head keeps the wound active. Peace begins when you step out of that battlefield. This does not mean denying what happened. It does not mean pretending the harm was acceptable. It means understanding that your inner calm is more valuable than proving a point that no longer leads to healing. In my experience, letting go of the need to be right feels at first like losing something important. The ego resists. It warns you that silence means defeat, that acceptance means weakness, that peace means erasure of your story. But these warnings are illusions. Letting go of being right does not erase your truth. It releases you from carrying it like a weapon. There is a profound difference between knowing the truth and needing it to be recognized. You can hold the truth quietly without letting it dominate your inner world. You can honor your experience without reliving it. You can stand in your dignity without standing in conflict. This is emotional freedom. Buddhism teaches that the ego thrives on comparison and judgment. It wants to label one person as wrong and another as right. This labeling creates separation inside the mind. When you identify with the role of the one who was wronged, pain becomes part of your identity. You are no longer someone who experienced hurt. You become someone defined by it. Choosing peace interrupts this identification. It allows you to say, "This happened to me, but it is not who I am." This shift is subtle, but transformative. The heart softens. The mind relaxes. The constant tension of defending yourself begins to dissolve. And in that dissolution, something unexpected appears: clarity. Clarity does not come from winning arguments. It comes from ending them. I want to share a personal conviction here, one I hold strongly. You do not lose your voice when you choose peace, you find it. The voice that emerges is quieter, but truer. It does not shout or justify. It does not rush to explain. It speaks when necessary and rests when it is not. This voice comes from self-trust, not from the need for validation. Many people fear that choosing peace means betraying themselves. But in reality, constantly fighting to be right is often a way of abandoning oneself. It keeps you tied to pain long after it has served any purpose. Peace is not passivity. Peace is precision. It is knowing when engagement leads to growth, and when it only feeds suffering. It is recognizing that some battles can only be won by walking away internally. Buddhism teaches that the highest victory is not winning an argument, but ending the inner war. And this war does not end through force. It ends through understanding. Understanding that no amount of explanation will change the past. Understanding that not everyone is capable of seeing you clearly. Understanding that your worth does not require agreement. When you let go of being right, compassion begins to rise not only for others, but for yourself. You see how much effort you spent trying to be understood, how much energy you lost replaying pain, how deeply you wanted acknowledgement. Instead of judging yourself for this, you meet yourself with kindness. This kindness is healing. In Buddhism, compassion without judgment is transformative. When you stop fighting yourself for wanting to be seen, you can finally rest. You realize that your struggle was human, that your pain made sense, and that you no longer need to carry it forward. Over time, choosing peace reshapes your inner world. You become less reactive, more stable, less pulled toward the past. You stop measuring your worth through conflict. You stop carrying conversations that never happened. You stop waiting for moments that may never come. This does not make you passive. It makes you free. Freedom is the ability to choose calm over chaos, clarity over confusion, and presence over replaying the past. Freedom is knowing that you can be at peace even when things were unfair. In my opinion, this is the most mature form of self-love. It is not loud. It does not announce itself. It does not demand recognition. It simply chooses what sustains life. Choosing peace over being right is not a single decision. It is a practice. The ego will return. The old arguments may resurface. And each time, you are given another opportunity to choose differently. Each time you let an argument go unfinished in your mind, you choose peace. Each time you release the need to explain, you choose peace. Each time you return to the present instead of the past, you choose peace. And slowly, something settles. You begin to feel whole again, not because the past disappeared, but because it no longer controls you. You realize something quietly powerful: you were never broken. You were never lost. You were simply distracted by pain. Letting go removes the distraction. What remains is clarity. What remains is peace. What remains is you present, aware and enough. Buddhism teaches that self-love is not about becoming someone new. It is about remembering who you were before suffering convinced you otherwise. Choosing peace is how that remembering happens. Quietly, gently, completely. And when you choose peace, you are not giving up your truth. You are choosing your life. At its heart, this entire journey has been about one quiet realization. Self-love is not something you prove, it is something you practice when no one is watching. It is not loud, defensive, or dramatic. It does not argue with the past or demand that pain make sense. Instead, it gently releases what no longer belongs in the present. Throughout this story, we have seen how suffering does not come only from what happened, but from how long we carry it. The mind, in its attempt to protect us, often turns a single moment into a lifelong burden, replaying memories, chasing explanations, waiting for apologies, and clinging to the need to be right. Buddhism does not ask us to erase the past or deny the pain. It asks us to stop living inside it. Letting go quietly is not weakness. It is wisdom. Silence is not avoidance. It is maturity. Detachment is not coldness. It is compassion for yourself. Forgiveness frees you not because others deserve it, but because you do. Closure does not arrive through someone else's words, but through insight that arises within you. When you stop carrying guilt, shame, and responsibility that were never yours, energy returns. Life softens. The present moment opens again. Perhaps the most powerful truth revealed in this journey is this: you were never broken. You were simply exhausted from holding on too tightly. When attachment loosens, peace does not need to be chased, it appears naturally. And when you choose peace over being right, the inner war finally ends. The deepest lesson here is simple, but not easy. Healing happens when you stop asking the past to give you what only the present can offer. So how can this be applied to your life today? Begin by noticing where your energy is going. Are you replaying old conversations? Waiting for someone to change? Carrying blame that isn't yours? Start gently withdrawing attention from what drains you. Practice pausing before reacting. Choose silence when explanation no longer brings peace. Allow emotions to arise without feeding them with stories. Return, again and again, to the body, the breath, and the present moment. You don't need to force healing. You don't need to rush letting go. Even small moments of awareness are enough to begin changing the direction of your inner life. Self-love grows quietly when you choose rest over resistance, clarity over confusion, and compassion over self-blame. Now we'd love to hear from you. What part of this message resonated most deeply with your own life? Have you experienced the freedom of letting go quietly, or are you still learning how? Share your thoughts and reflections in the comments so others can learn from your journey too. And if this message brought you clarity, comfort, or insight, please subscribe to Buddhism in every moment. Your support helps us continue creating meaningful, mindful content that speaks to the heart and supports healing one quiet moment at a time. Thank you for being here.